about the Black Swan bit. And I've got 9, I'll call them myths, and by myths I simply mean they're not scientifically proven, they're commonsensical really, about terrorism that I think you tend to get if your focus is only on events like 9/11 and a handful of others. I'll use 9/11 as an example, but Mumbai, London, Madrid all come to mind here as well. Myth number 1, terrorism was rapidly increasing in the years leading up to 9/11. And you know, if you got all of the press coverage, you sort of think there's no problem in the 1970s, you know, sort of a growing smooth line as we go through time. But now that we actually have data to look at this, the story is actually much more complicated. So the red line on top of the chart is total attacks, and you see this big run up to about 1991, and then a big drop, a kind of a trough, and then in 2011 we're very near a new high. And in fact 2012, which is not released to the public yet, I'm pretty sure we're going to have a new record high. But what we have is not a kind of a smooth transitional thing. In fact, around 9/11 it was actually quite low, among the lowest in the whole series. I don't think anybody's explained why the big drop-off after 1991, but my personal hunch is the collapse of the Soviet Union. A lot of terrorist organizations that had sort of Marxist-Leninist foundations went into decline at that period in time. But nonetheless, my point is the highest amount of terrorism, at least through 2011, was not in 2002, but instead in 1992. So considerably more complex. Myth number 2, terrorist attacks every corner of the world. Again, if you watch the media, you'd think that there's no place where you're safe from terrorism. And in fact, if I had $1 for every time I've seen the image of fully loaded jet planes crashing into the World Trade Centers, I'd probably be retiring much earlier in life. So these images are so iconic, they make us feel like we're not safe no matter where we're at. And the kind of blanket media coverage really suggests this. But if you look at the data, events are in fact highly, highly concentrated. I can do this on a number of levels. In some ways, the most obvious is the country level. If we look at terrorism in the database across countries, about 5% of the countries of the world account for about 50% of all attacks, and about 10% of the world's countries account for about 75% of all the attacks. And what's interesting, and Jen and I were just talking about this before we walked in, is that I'm using the nation level as an example, but it's concentrated at every level. If you look at, it's concentrated at the city level, it's concentrated within neighborhoods within cities, that it's like crime, that it tends to be a very concentrated activity. So, myth number 3, and this one may be less relevant to a European audience than a US audience, but I think it's a common idea in the United States, is the US is especially likely to be targeted, that they're targeted more frequently by terrorists than any other country in the world. And again, if you see the devastating impact of 9/11, it would lead many observers to this kind of a conclusion. But again, if you use the GTD to look at terrorism in a much broader context, we find that, in fact, up through 2011, the United States finished number 14 as the most frequently attacked country, and 16 in terms of total fatalities. And you note the total fatalities of 3467, if you can read that in the back of the room. 9/11 was nearly 3,000. If you back the 9/11 4-coordinated attacks out, the United States has a fatality rate that's about the same as Canada or Greece. So it's not particularly likely to be attacked. Myth number 4. Most terrorist attacks involve disgruntled groups and individuals from one country carrying out attacks on civilians in other countries. And again, we look at these black swan events like 9/11 and we get this sort of an image that a lot of terrorism is sort of unhappy people from one country going to other countries to do a lot of damage. Now, before anyone ever collected domestic data on terrorism, you couldn't really systematically look at this question. But once we had the data, we could start to look at it. And in a project I did with Martha Crenshaw and Su-Ming Yang, we took the 53 organizations that the U.S. State Department, the foreign organizations the U.S. State Department said posed the most serious threat to the United States. So not a random set of terrorist organizations, but those the U.S. State Department saw as the most dangerous to the United States. And then we simply looked at where did they do their attacks. And what we found, I think, surprised even us, actually, because The yellow lines are domestic attacks, and the red lines are international or transnational attacks. And we can go into more detail about what those differences are. But we have a very conservative definition of what a domestic attack is. And you can see that 93% of the attacks and almost 93% of the fatalities are domestic. And this includes, by the way, so we would include an attack on a US embassy in, say, Pakistan as a transnational attack, basically. And it's still, with those statistics, the vast majority of these attacks are domestic. So you have a Pakistani group attacking a Pakistani target in Pakistan in the vast majority of these cases. And these are some pretty heavy hitters. We're talking about 17,000 attacks and almost 40,000 total fatalities. Myth number 5, terrorism is unrelated to traditional political grievances. The kind of irrational plans of Al-Qaeda and the Al-Qaeda-inspired attacks of 9/11 make it easy to lose sight of the fact that a large number of terrorist attacks involve fairly rational political disputes, usually over territory. And again, when we use the GTD to sort of take a broad look at active terrorist organizations in the world, we find that a large proportion of them involve groups that are essentially fighting about territory. Now, you may totally disagree with their methods, but at least there's a bit of a rational spin to it. And I know we've got a lot of experts in the room, and so you can take a look and see what you think yourself. These are the top 20 in our database, terrorist organizations from 1970 to 2011. Shining Path comes out as number 1, clearly about space, right? The Farabundu Multinational Liberation Front, they're trying to take over the country. Irish Republican Army, they want their own homeland. Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, FARC, trying to take over Colombia. The Taliban, I mean, go through the list. It's amazing how many of these groups are really about taking over contested territory. So at least rational in that sense. Myth number 6, most terrorist attacks are incredibly lethal. Again, because of the incredible lethality of an attack like 9/11, it's easy to suppose that most terrorist attacks are incredibly lethal. But what happens when you look at the whole database? We find that going back to 1970, 56% of the terrorist attacks in our database killed no one. And sometimes I show this to experts and they say, well, how can it be terrorism? It didn't kill anyone. Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of times terrorists attack infrastructure. They're trying to disrupt communications or disrupt transportation. Other cases, they plan to kill people, but they fail. And in other cases, they warn people because for reasons of legitimacy, they don't want to kill a lot of people. So this was very common for ETA and the IRA and the Red Brigades and some other groups. Now, this led, in fact, Brian Jenkins, who we were just talking about, he has this great statement from, I think, 30 years ago. He says, terrorists want a lot of people watching, they don't want a lot of people dead. Now, what's interesting about this is, if you divide these two periods, that is 1970 to 2006, which is in white, and 2007 to the present, which is red, is terrorism is getting deadlier over time. So, in fact, Brian revised his earlier statement to say recently that terrorists want a lot of people watching and a lot of people dead. Nonetheless, even in this new period we find ourselves in, almost half a little over half the cases involve no fatalities. Myth number 7. Most terrorist attacks rely on sophisticated weaponry. When we look at the coordinated attacks of 9/11, there was long-term planning, split-second timing, very innovative use of existing resources, and the sophistication of 9/11 pales into insignificance compared to the diabolical sophistication of the enemies that are faced regularly by the Homeland series, by Claire Danes, by Kiefer Sutherland, by Kurt Wallander, by Bruce Willis. If you look at the terrorism cases in the media, they're incredibly sophisticated. So it gives you the idea that most terrorism uses very sophisticated weaponry and so on. But when you look at 104,000 cases for 40-some years, you find that by far the biggest number of them, over 46%, are explosives. And we're not talking about, for the